Okay, so where does this idea of 613 mitzvot come from? So in the Rambam, in his introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot, he says that after he wrote, Sefer HaMitzvot is the Rambam's compilation of the 613 mitzvot, he explains that after he wrote his Perush HaMishnah, his commentary, his explanation on Mishnayot, he wanted to preface his Mishnah Torah, which was his halachic compendium, with a list of all the mitzvot, because as he says, he could not find a list which was satisfactory to him in terms of which mitzvot are to be included and which mitzvot are not included. The Gemara in Makot, Daf Chaf Gimel Amud Bet, tells us the idea of 613 mitzvot, which they don't give a source for, but they give a mnemonic, if you will, a sort of a supporting evidence to this idea, is noting that there are 365 negative commandments and 248 positive commandments. The 365 negative commandments correspond to the days in a solar year, and the 248 positive commandments correspond to the number of limbs that are associated with the human body. Each limb has a mandate, has an imperative to do positive mitzvot. Where do we get this idea of 613? So one place you might be familiar with is the Midrash that Rashi quotes. When Yaakov is about to reunite with his brother Esav, he sends messengers and tells them that the reason why I've been delayed and we haven't met for so many years is because Im Lavan Garti ve'ichararata. I've been living with Lavan until this time, and that's why I'm delayed in reuniting with you. And there the Midrash, Rashi quotes the Midrash, Im Lavan Garti, I've lived with Lavan, and the message is Taryag Mitzvot Shamarti. Garti has numerical value in the same letters as Taryag, 613. So there we already see an early source for this idea that we incorporated in the Torah are 613 commandments. Everyone counts these numbers: 613 commandments, 365 negative commandments, 248 positive commandments. But there are different lists of what are included, right? So in other words, it's sort of like you start with the end. The end is, this is the rubric, this is the list of mitzvot. 613 total, 365 don'ts, do nots, 248 do's, and then you go through the text and you decide based on your rules of what counts as a mitzvah, because if you count every time God told Moshe to tell the Jewish people, there'll be many more than 613. So you have to have certain criteria, certain requirements for what counts as a mitzvah, what does not count as a mitzvah. How different do commandments have to be in order to be different mitzvot? How many different ideas can be incorporated into one mitzvah? Are mitzvot only things that are relevant for all times? Can they be a command for a specific moment in Jewish history? At that moment in time during the times of the writing of the Torah. So these are all rules. There are many, many rules. And depending on how you relate to those rules, what are your rules? That will depend on what gets included in the list. Do you make the list of 613 or not? So the Rambam has a list of 14 principles he uses in counting mitzvot. In other words, to explain why for him certain mitzvot are in and certain mitzvot are out. Now, these arguments are primarily scholastic, sort of intellectual only. They do not disagree whether an action is mandatory or forbidden. The only question is whether it is formally counted as one of the 613. They only disagree whether certain commandments are independent or part of other commandments and not counted on their own, right? So again, there's very little disagreement among the Monei HaMitzvot, those who took upon this endeavor, this task of counting mitzvot. I don't think in any case there's an instance where one person counts it as a mitzvah to do, and the other person says, no, not only is it not a mitzvah, but you're not allowed to do it. We don't find that. In other words, we might find that different opinions count it as a mitzvah, whereas others will say, it's not a mitzvah, it's a good idea. Or it's not a mitzvah for all time, and therefore it's technically excluded, but it is a anhaga tova, it's recommended, but it may not be a formal mitzvah, right? So there's a lot more agreement, even though there are many, many lists of the 613 mitzvot, Sefer Mitzvot of the Rambam, Sefer Mitzvot of the Ramban, etc., still there's a lot of agreement. And even where they don't agree, it's not like one says it's allowed and one says it's not allowed. They'll both say it's allowed, but one will count it as a mitzvah, and the other one will say it's not included as a formal mitzvah because of, A, B, C, and D. The Vilna Gaon's brother of Avram explains that really every word that is expressed by Hashem is a mitzvah. However, 613 are the roots, are the essential principles, commandments that expand into numerous branches. And that's his idea of Eitz Chaim Hi Lamachazikim Ba. What does it mean that the Torah is a tree of life? The Torah itself is a Devar Hashem. Every word that God commanded is a mitzvah, and it branches out into the 613 commandments. Whereas really its leaves are countless. There's so many different ways to connect with God. There are so many, almost innumerable ways that God commands us to live our lives. But not every single one of them is formalized, codified as a formal mitzvah. We're familiar with for instance, even the categorization of positive and negative precepts. We mentioned the Gemara in Makot, etc. 365 lavs, lo taseh, don't do, 248 positive commandments. So we have lots of these efforts. But the truth is that that's also subject to some debate. How many larger categories of mitzvot are there? Rav Saadia Gaon, for instance, said there are really three categories of mitzvot. They're the two we're familiar with that I've already mentioned: the lo taseh, the don'ts, 365, the do's, which we normally count as 248. However, the Rav Saadia Gaon says there's another category. Not there's more than 613. There's only 613, but they're divided into don'ts and do's, and also those mitzvahs that apply to a community as a whole, but entail no personal responsibility on the individual. It's not something for me or you to do. It's something for Klal Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael, Beit Din, some sort of formal structure within the Jewish people. It's incumbent upon them. It's not incumbent upon an individual to accomplish in his or her daily lives or annual rituals. Now, of course, picking up from what the Vilna Gaon's brother Avram said, our obligations are not exhausted by formal mitzvot. As we know, the Torah embraces a value system that impose obligations even though they are not formally formulated as commandments, right? So to do the right thing, to be holy, right? To stay far away from falsehood. These are not formal specific actions that I can point to. These are values. These are overall guiding principles that are going to manifest themselves in numerous, if not countless ways over the course of our days and our lives. And therefore, obviously, there are many more, there's much more direction and guidance and guidelines that extend beyond formal count of the minyan and mitzvah. And as we know, just to sort of fast forward to today, 2020, Tafshin Pei, many mitzvot that are included in the formal 613 are not accessible to us in the absence of ritual purity and impurity laws as mandated with the purification of the ashes of the red heifer, the paraduma, or the obligations associated with a formal Beit Din process, Sanhedrin, or those that are associated with a Mizbeach, or a menorah, or a temple service, or Beit HaMikdash. All of those are off limits. According to common conventional wisdom, out of the 613 mitzvot, only 369 are available and relevant to a person today. Um, 99 of them out of the 369, 78 positive and 21 negative, 99 are, well, maybe applicable to some today, may not necessarily be accomplished or relevant to any specific person. For example, the obligation to pay a day laborer on time is relevant today and is obligatory today on employers of day laborers. If you're not an employer, or if you're not an employer of a day laborer, right, you have a contract with people, you pay them bi-weekly or salaried or whatever the case is, then this would not be relevant to you. But if you do hire a day laborer, then you are obligated to pay them, you're obligated to pay them on time. So if there are 99 that are only for some people, then there's 270 that are relevant to all of us, to all individuals. And that's 48 positive commandments, 222 negative commandments, right? Can you imagine? Out of 248, only 48 are relevant or are liable for all of us. All of us have the opportunity to fulfill this mitzvot without looking for the chance, without being a specific type of person. Those are the ones we have. Many, almost 5 times as many no's as we do yes. Right? That's why Judaism, certainly halachic Judaism, has a reputation of being restrictive. Well, that seems to be that's fair. There's a mnemonic actually that tells us this. That is used to remind us of this, based on a pasuk in Shir Hashirim. Ani yeshena v'libi er. I am sleeping and my heart is awake. The gematria of the word er, ayin resh, is 270. So in other words, even when we are sleeping in galut, even when we are not fully have the full opportunity to engage in mitzvah observance because of the limitations that are placed on us, not just geographically, but even those that live in Israel, although they have certain mitzvot that they are able to accomplish, there are many others that are not accessible. So, ani yeshena libi er, my heart is always looking to the mitzvot that I'm able to do, all 270 of them, plus an additional 99 that, depending on your stature, depending on your status, depending on your role, you maybe have the opportunity to do. Of these, there are 6 mitzvot tmidiot, 6 mitzvot that are applicable at all times, most of them related to our thoughts. Avat Hashem, Yirat Hashem, those things, right? Having the proper perspective on things. Those are the type of mitzvot that are tmidiot, applicable at all times. Where do we get this idea that there's 613? So we mentioned Im Lavan Garti, but the other source is famously the pasuk Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe taught us, commanded us the Torah. The gematria, the numerical value of the word Torah, is 611. Moshe commanded us on 611 commandments. God himself, b'chvodo v'atzmo, commanded us on 2 commandments, the first 2 commandments of the 10 commandments at Mount Sinai. If you read the text, especially with the help of the Midrash, Hashem began speaking to the Jewish people, and after a couple of commandments, the people said, we can't handle it, we can't tolerate God's voice. So the other 8, Moshe conveyed the message from God. So Hashem taught 2 mitzvot, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe taught Torah, the gematria of Torah 611, which gives you a total of 613 mitzvot. As we said, you can't go through the text and expect to find the 613, because there are many, many more times that there's this idea of commandment, of obligation in the Torah. Now, the first attempt to develop a scholarly criteria for counting commandments was over 1,000 years ago in the Hilchot Gedolot by Rosh Shimon Kera. And he was sort of the pace setter in the field. The Ibn Ezra says that Rav Kaira, the Hilchot Gedolot, Bal Hilchot Gedolot, was not the first attempt to codify the 613. Rather, it happened 2,000 years earlier, right after Moshe, in Yeshua's time. Yeshua did something similar. Hashem commands Bnei Yisrael to record the entire Torah in 70 language on 12 stones after crossing the Jordan. According to Ibn Ezra, they listed the 613 commandments in each language. Right? So it wasn't the entire text of the Torah, it was the 613 commandments, says the Ibn Ezra. Later generations had no record of which commandments were included in this listing of 613. And the Hilchot Gedolot certainly was widely accepted and an early rejuvenator of this discipline of seeking out which 613 commandments are included in the mitzvot. But even he was challenged. Rav Simlai's statement underwent heavy critical analysis. What's included in the 613, is it really only 613? Rav Saadia Gaon had his own list. And the Rambam challenged Rav Saadia Gaon's and the Baal Hilchot Gedolos list. His compilation, as we've already mentioned, is the Sefer HaMitzvot. And then the Mishnah Torah includes all 613 mitzvot. Even what's unique about the Rambam's list is even those he explains in detail in the Sefer, in the Mishnah Torah, even those mitzvot that are not relevant today, right? So he has full sections on Tuma and Karbanot and the Avodah and the Beit HaMikdash, etc. There are dozens of volumes and poems authored throughout the generations on this theme of Taryag, on this theme of 613 mitzvot. Earlier generations used the Baal Hilchot Gedolot, and later generations preferred the Rambam's list. One thing everyone agreed is that a listing of mitzvot was useful to gain perspective on the mitzvot and their message. So, for example, Rav Moshe Akusi memorized all 613 mitzvot as a personal checklist as he set out to tour Jewish communities in France and Spain. And people loved it, right? He would come and he would perform, he would go through all the mitzvot. Wanted him to write a book, but out of modesty, he refused. And then the story goes that the Sar Mikusi, in a dream, was commanded to write this book of mitzvot to be in two sections, the Sefer, the Assays and the Lo Tasses, and that's why he wrote the Sefer HaMitzvot HaGadol, the Smag, Sefer HaMitzvot HaGadol. And soon after, the listing of mitzvot became more concise, done by Rav Yitzchak of Korvel, which he called the Sefer Mitzvot Katan, not the big book of mitzvot, but the little book of mitzvot, not fewer mitzvot, but arranged in a more concise fashion. Now in Spain, things were different. Remember, this was France. This was mostly France. In Spain, there was no need for a mitzvah listing as a replacement for banned books like it was in Europe. Remember, in Christian Europe, it was necessary to have other mnemonics and other fora in order to maintain a living reminder of the mitzvah. In Spain, not so much. But in Spain, the need was for a book that could be used as a refresher of all mitzvot for scholars and the non-scholar alike. And poets, similarly in Spain, would weave all 613 mitzvot into a poem to be recited once a year on Shavuot night. Right? There's a Ashkenazic practice to include all the to read Tikkun Leil Shavuot, a little bit of all of the Tanakh and Talmud and Gemara, right, on Shavuot night. So there's other formulations of this was to read poems that included mention of all the mitzvot, all the 613 mitzvot on Shavuot night as a way to stay up. The most famous is the Azharot of Rav Shlomo Ibn Gavirol, and many Sfardim still recite this poem. The Sar Mikusi, the Sefer Mitzvot HaGadol, listed all mitzvot on 7 pages to review one page a day weekly. So you would review all, our learning is formulated through, let's say, Mishnah Yomi, or Rambam Yomi, or Daf Yomi, or Daf HaShavua, or learning an Aliyah a day of Shnai Mikra. So the Sar Mikusi wanted you to review all 613 mitzvot, to be reminded of them on a weekly basis, 1 page of mitzvot a day, 7 pages total. Rav Aaron Alevi of Barcelona arranged the mitzvot in the very popular book Sefer HaChinuch, according to the weekly parsha, to encourage his son and other youth. The story goes that Rav Aaron Alevi of Barcelona wrote the book in honor of his son's bar mitzvah. And that's why it's a relatively easy read. We read through it to reflect on the mitzvot of the week. What's the lesson of the week? The mitzvot of the week. And as he quotes it, occupy your minds with pure thoughts and meaningful calculations, lest you take into your hearts other calculations of insignificance, meaninglessness, and even when they grow older, mitzvot shall not depart from them. Lo tamosh Torah mipicha. Right, so this will be your focus. You'll know how many mitzvot are in each parsha. You'll have reviewed which mitzvot are in each parsha. The weekly Parsha Shavua system for listing mitzvot, utilized later by Rabbi Yeshayahu Horowitz in his famous book, The Shalah, Shnei Luchot HaBrit. And the review of mitzvot each week was revived by the Shach in the 17th century in his work, Poel Tzedek, where all 613 mitzvot are each identified with one pasuk and divided into 7 sections to be completed weekly. The Shach, whereas these systems have you reviewing all 613 mitzvot every week, or the Sefer Chinuch every year, the Shach really wanted people to review all 613 mitzvot every day. And his 7-day division was only a concession for those unable to keep pace, based on the idea of Yomush HaTorah Mipicha. Do not forget the Torah as expressed, manifested through the 613 commandments. Right? So there was an emphasis on learning the 613 mitzvot, of knowing them, of reviewing them on an annual, weekly, or even daily basis. The Chavetz Chaim, before the shul closed in March, Rabbi Freiberg and I were going through the Sefer HaMitzvot HaKatzar, which I believe he finished reviewing when he was teaching each night in the evenings. The Sefer HaMitzvot HaKatzar, was written by the Chavetz Chaim, and it's those mitzvot that are relevant today, right? Offering brief descriptions of mitzvot relevant in our times. I think he counts 79 mitzvot that are relevant, plus another few that are relevant only in Eretz Yisrael. His recommendation is that you should read half the Assays on Monday, the other half on Thursdays, and the following week, half the Lo Tases on Monday, and the other half on Thursday, right? So the Chavetz Chaim has a shorter list, and he suggested that you review all the mitzvot over every 2 weeks. So again, it's this idea of we may not be familiar with it, this idea of reviewing mitzvot on an ongoing basis, which can only happen if you identify the mitzvot. What are the number, what are the parameter, and how do we decide which mitzvot are in? The common denominator throughout the 1,000 years since the Baal Hilchot Gedolot is it's vital for Jews to review mitzvot regularly. Studying Targum mitzvot may not be so well known, may not be so popular, but it provides both the medium and the message for an individual to, in search of Torah knowledge, to have a compact framework of a system, especially if you not only learn the mitzvah and the details of the mitzvah, but especially if you look at Sefer Chinuch, for instance, it'll give you a brief Tam HaMitzvah, right? Not the what of the mitzvah, but the why. Not the what or the how, but the why. Why is this? Why do we fulfill this mitzvah? Sefer Chinuch is just one source. The Shalah is another, which gives you, concise, compact reasons for the mitzvot. And it's this combination of knowing, right? You can't be a good Jew unless you know what to do, and you can't be a thoughtful Jew unless you think about why you do what you do. And an emphasis as part of our overall learning strategy and learning plans, including Sefer, reviewing 613 mitzvot, allows us to become well-rounded, educated, knowledgeable, literate, and thoughtful members of the Jewish people. Okay, we will stop there and pick up again tomorrow. Have a wonderful day, and see you again tomorrow at noon. Bye-bye.